Chapter 20, Part 1 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20, George Eliot, Part 1. Correspondence with George Eliot, George Eliot's first impressions of Mrs. Stowe, Mrs. Stowe's letter to Mrs. Follen, George Eliot's letter to Mrs. Stowe, Mrs. Stowe's reply, Life in Florida, Robert Dale Owen and Modern Spiritualism, George Eliot's letter on the phenomena of spiritualism, Mrs. Stowe's description of scenery in Florida, Mrs. Stowe concerning Middlemarch, George Eliot to Mrs. Stowe during Reverend H.W. Beecher's trial, Mrs. Stowe concerning her life experience with her brother, H.W. Beecher, and his trial, Mrs. Lewes' last letter to Mrs. Stowe, diverse mental characteristics of these two women, Mrs. Stowe's final estimate of modern spiritualism. It is with a feeling of relief that we turn from one of the most disagreeable experiences of Mrs. Stowe's life to one of the most delightful, namely, the warm friendship of one of the most eminent women of this age, George Eliot. There seems to have been some deep affinity of feeling that drew them closely together in spite of diversity of intellectual tastes. George Eliot's attention was first personally attracted to Mrs. Stowe in 1853 by means of a letter which the latter had written to Mrs. Follen. Speaking of this incident, George Eliot, writes, quote, Mrs. Follen showed me a delightful letter which she has just had from Mrs. Stowe, telling all about herself. She begins by saying, I am a little bit of a woman, rather more than 40, as withered and dry as a pinch of snuff, never very well worth looking at in my best days, and now a decidedly used-up article. The whole letter is most fascinating and makes one love her. Footnote from George Eliot's Life, edited by J.W. Cross, Volume 1. End of footnote. The correspondence between these two notable women was begun by Mrs. Stowe and called forth the following extremely interesting letter from the distinguished English novelist. The Priory, 21 North Bank, May 8, 1869. My dear friend, I value very highly the warrant to call you friend which your letter has given me. It lay awaiting me on our return the other night from a 9-week absence in Italy, and it made me almost wish that you could have a momentary vision of the discouragement, nay, paralyzing despondency, in which many days of my writing life have been passed, in order that you might fully understand the good I find in such sympathy as yours, in such an assurance as you give me that my work has been worth doing. But I will not dwell on any mental sickness of mine. The best joy your words give me is the sense of that sweet, generous feeling in which you dictated them. I shall always be the richer because you have in this way made me know you better. I must tell you that my first glimpse of you as a woman came through a letter of yours and charmed me very much. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Follen, and one morning I called on her in London, how many years ago, and she was kind enough to read it to me because it contained a little history of your life and a sketch of your domestic circumstances. I remember thinking that it was very kind of you to write that long letter in reply to inquiries of one who was personally unknown to you, and looking back with my present experience, I think it was kinder than it then appeared, for at that moment you must have been much oppressed with the immediate results of your fame. I remember, too, that you wrote of your husband as one who was richer in Hebrew and Greek than in pounds or shillings, and as an ardent scholar has always been a character of peculiar interest to me, I have rarely had your image in mind without the accompanying image, more or less erroneous, of such a scholar by your side. I shall welcome the fruit of his Goethe studies whenever it comes. I have good hopes that your fears are groundless as to the obstacles your new book, Old Town Folks, may find here from its thorough American character. Most readers who are likely to be really influenced by writing above the common order will find that special aspect an added reason for interest and study. and I dare say you have long seen, as I am beginning to see with new clearness, that if a book which has any sort of exquisiteness happens also to be a popular, widely circulated book, the power over the social mind for any good is, after all, due to its reception by a few appreciative natures, and is the slow result of radiation from that narrow circle. I mean that you can affect a few souls, and that each of these in turn may affect a few more, but that no exquisite book tells properly and directly on a multitude, however largely it may spread by type and paper. Witness the things the multitude will say about it, if one is so unhappy as to be obliged to hear their sayings. I do not write this cynically, but in pure sadness and pity. Both traveling abroad and staying home among our English sights and sports, how slowly the centuries work toward the moral good of men, and that thought lies very close to what you say as to your wonder or conjecture concerning my religious point of view. I believe that religion, too, has to be modified according to the dominant phases, that a religion more perfect than any yet prevalent must express less care of personal consolation and the more deeply awing sense of responsibility to man, springing from sympathy with that which of all things is most certainly known to us, the difficulty of the human lot. Letters are necessarily narrow and fragmentary, and when one writes on wide subjects are likely to create more misunderstanding than illumination. But I have little anxiety in writing to you, dear friend and fellow laborer, for you have had longer experience than I as a writer, and fuller experience as a woman, since you have borne children and known a mother's history from the beginning. I trust your quick and long-taught mind as an interpreter little liable to mistake me. When you say, quote, "We live in an orange grove and are planting many more," and when I think you must have abundant family love to cheer you, it seems to me that you must have a paradise about you. But no list of circumstances will make a paradise. Nevertheless, I must believe that the joyous, tender humor of your books clings about your more immediate life and makes some of that sunshine for yourself which you have given to us. I see the advertisement of Old Town folks, and shall eagerly expect it. That and every other new link between us will be reverentially valued. With great devotion and regard, yours always, M. L. Lewes. Mrs. Stowe writes from Mandarin to George Eliot. Mandarin, February 8th, 1872. Dear friend, it is 2 years nearly since I had your last very kind letter, and I have never answered, because 2 years of constant and severe work have made it impossible to give a drop to anything beyond the needs of the hour. Yet I have always thought of you, loved you, trusted you all the same, and read every little scrap from your writing that came to hand. One thing brings you back to me. I am now in Florida in my little hut in the orange orchard, with the broad expanse of the blue St. John's in front, and the waving of the live oaks, with their long gray mosses overhead, and the bright gold of oranges looking through dusky leaves around. It is like Sorrento, so like that I can quite dream of being there. And when I get here I enter another life. The world recedes. I am out of it. It ceases to influence. Its bustle and noise die away in the far distance. And here is no winter, an open-air life, a quaint, rude, wild, wilderness sort of life, both rude and rich. But when I am here I write more letters to friends than ever I do elsewhere. The mail comes only twice a week, and then is the event of the day. My old rabbi and I here set up our tent, he with German and Greek and Hebrew, devouring all sorts of black-letter books, and I spinning ideal webs out of bits that he lets fall here and there. I have long thought that I would write to you again when I got here, and so I do. I have sent North to have them send me the Harper's Weekly, in which your new story is appearing, and have promised myself leisurely to devour and absorb every word of it. While I think of it, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine, a most noble man, Mr. Owen, for some years our ambassador at Naples, now living a literary and scholar life in America. His father was Robert Dale Owen, the theorist and communist you may have heard of in England some years since. Years ago, in Naples, I visited Mr. Owen for the first time and found him directing his attention to the phenomena of spiritism. He had stumbled upon some singular instances of it accidentally, and he had forthwith instituted a series of researches and experiments on the subject, some of which he showed me. It was the first time I had ever seriously thought of the matter, and he invited my sister and myself to see some of the phenomena as exhibited by a medium friend of theirs who resided in their family. The result at the time was sufficiently curious, but I was interested in his account of the manner in which he proceeded, keeping records of every experiment with its results in classified orders. As a result of his studies and observations, he has published 2 books. One, Footfalls on the Boundary of Another World, published in 1860, and latterly, The Debatable Land Between This World and the Next. I regard Mr. Owen as one of the few men who are capable of entering into an inquiry of this kind without an utter drowning of common sense, and his books are both of them worth a fair reading. To me, they present a great deal that is intensely curious and interesting, although I do not admit, of course, all his deductions, and think he often takes too much for granted. Still, with every abatement there remains a residuum of fact, which I think both curious and useful. In a late letter to me he says, quote, "There is no writer of the present day whom I more esteem than Mrs. Lewes, nor any one whose opinion of my work I should more highly value." End quote. I believe he intends sending them to you, and I hope you will read them. Lest some of the narratives should strike you, as such narratives did me once, as being a perfect Arabian Nights entertainment, I want to say that I have accidentally been in the way of confirming some of the most remarkable by personal observation. In regard to all this class of subjects, I am of the opinion of Goethe that, quote, "it is just as absurd to deny the facts of spiritualism now as it was in the Middle Ages to ascribe them to the devil." End quote. I think Mr. Owen attributes too much value to his facts. I do not think the things contributed from the ultra-mundane sphere are particularly valuable, apart from the evidence they give of continued existence after death. I do not think there is yet any evidence to warrant the idea that they are a supplement or continuation of the revelations of Christianity, but I do regard them as an interesting and curious study in psychology, and every careful observer, like Mr. Owen, ought to be welcomed to bring in his facts. With this, I shall send you my observations on Mr. Owen's books from the Christian Union. I am perfectly aware of the frivolity and worthlessness of much of the revealings purported to come from spirits. In my view, the worth or worthlessness of them has nothing to do with the question of the fact. Do invisible spirits speak in any wise, wise or foolish, is the question a priori. I do not know of any reason why there should not be as many foolish virgins in the future state as in this. As I am a believer in the Bible and Christianity, I don't need these things as confirmations, and they are not likely to be a religion to me. I regard them simply as I do the phenomenon of the aurora borealis, or Darwin's studies on natural selection, as curious studies into nature. Besides, I think some day we shall find a law by which all these facts will fall into their places. I hope now this subject does not bore you. It certainly is one that seems increasingly to insist on getting itself heard. It is going on, making converts who are many more than dare avow themselves, and for my part I wish it were all brought into the daylight of inquiry. Let me hear from you if ever you feel like it. I know too well the possibilities and impossibilities of a nature like yours to ask more, but it can do you no harm to know that I still think of you and love you as ever. Faithfully yours, H.B. Stowe. The Priory, 21 North Bank, Regent's Park, March 4, 1872. Dear friend, I can understand very easily that the last 2 years have been full for you of other and more imperative work than the writing of letters not absolutely demanded, either by charity or business. The proof that you still think of me affectionately is very welcome now it has come, and more cheering because it enables me to think of you as enjoying your retreat in your orange orchard, your western Sorrento, the beloved rabbi still beside you. I am sure it must be a great blessing to you to bathe in that quietude, as it always is to us when we go out of reach of London influences and have the large space of country days to study, walk, and talk in. When I am more at liberty, I will certainly read Mr. Owen's books, if he is good enough to send them to me. I desire on all subjects to keep an open mind, but hitherto the various phenomena, reported or attested in connection with ideas of spirit intercourse and so on, have come before me here in the painful form of the lowest charlatanery. But apart from personal contact with people who get money by public exhibitions as mediums, or with semi-idiots such as those who make a court for a Mrs. Blank, or other feminine personages of that kind, I would not willingly place any barriers between my mind and any possible channel of truth affecting the human lot. The spirit in which you have written in the paper you kindly sent me is likely to touch others and rouse them at least to attention in a case where you have been deeply impressed. Yours with sincere affection, M. L. Lewes. Begun April 4th by Mrs. Stowe. Mandarin, Florida, May 11th, 1872. My dear friend, I was very glad to get your dear little note. Sorry to see by it that you are not in your full physical force. Owing to the awkwardness and misunderstanding of publishers, I am not reading Middlemarch, as I expected to be, here in these orange shades. They don't send it, and I am too far out of the world to get it. I felt when I read your letters how glad I should be to have you here in our Florida cottage, in the wholly new, wild, woodland life. Though resembling Italy in climate, it is wholly different in the appearance of nature. The plants, the birds, the animals, all different. The green tidiness and culture of England here gives way to a wild and rugged savageness of beauty. Every tree bursts forth with flowers. Wild vines and creepers execute delirious gambols, and weave and interweave in interminable labyrinths. Yet here, the great sandy plains back of our house, there is a constant wondering sense of beauty in the wild, wonderful growths of nature. First of all, the pines, high as the stone pines of Italy, with long leaves, 18 inches long, through which there is a constant dreamy sound, as if of dashing waters. Then the live oaks and the water oaks, narrow-leaved evergreens which grow to enormous size and whose branches are draped with long festoons of gray moss. There is a great wild park of these trees back of us, which, with the dazzling varnished green of the new spring leaves and the swaying drapery of moss, looks like a sort of enchanted grotto. Underneath grow up hollies and ornamental flowering shrubs, and the yellow jasmine climbs into and over everything with fragrant golden bells and buds, so that sometimes the foliage of the tree is wholly hidden in its embrace. This wild, wonderful, bright and vivid growth, that is all new, strange, and unknown by name to me, has a charm for me. It is the place to forget the outside world, and to live in one's self. And if you were here, we would go together and gather azaleas and white lilies and silver bells and blue iris. These flowers keep me painting in a sort of madness. I have just finished a picture of white lilies that grow in the moist land by the watercourses. I am longing to begin on blue iris. Artist, poet, as you are by nature, you ought to see all these things. And if you would come here, I would take you in heart and house, and you should have a little room in our cottage. The history of the cottage is this. I found a hut built close to a great live oak 25 feet in girth, and with overarching boughs 80 feet up in the air, spreading like a firmament, and all swaying with mossy festoons. We began to live here, and gradually we improved the hut by lath, plaster, and paper. Then we threw out a wide veranda all around, for in these regions the veranda is the living room of the house. Ours had to be built round the trunk of a tree, so that our cottage has a peculiar and original air, and seems as if it were half tree, or a something that has grown out of the tree. We added on parts, and have thrown out gables and chambers, as a tree throws out new branches, till our cottage is like nobody else's, and yet we settle into it with real enjoyment. There are all sorts of queer little rooms in it, and we are accommodating at this present a family of 17 souls. In front, the beautiful Grand St. John stretches 5 miles from shore to shore, and we watch the steamboats plying back and forth to the great world we are out of. On all sides, large orange trees, with their dense shade and ever-vivid green, shut out the sun so that we can sit and walk and live in the open air. Our winter here is only cool, bracing outdoor weather, without snow. No month without flowers blooming in the open air, and lettuce and peas in the garden. The summer range is about 90 degrees, but the sea breezes keep the air delightfully fresh. Generally we go north, however, for 3 months of summer. Well, I do not mean to run on about Florida, but the subject runs away with me, and I want you to visit us in spirit, if not personally. My poor rabbi, he sends you some Arabic, which I fear you cannot read. On diablerie he is up to his ears in knowledge, having read all things in all tongues, from the Talmud down. Ever lovingly yours, H.B. Stowe. Boston, September 26, 1872. My dear friend, I think when you see my name again so soon, you will think it rains, hails, and snows notes from this quarter. Just now, however, I am in this lovely little nest in Boston, where dear Mrs. Fields, like a dove, sits brooding on the charmed wave. We are both wishing we had you here with us, and she has not received any answer from you as yet in reply to the invitation you spoke of in your last letter to me. It seems as if you must have written, and the letter somehow gone astray, because I know, of course, you would write. Yesterday, reading Middlemarch, we were both out of our senses with mingled pity and indignation at that dreadful stick of a Casaubon, and to think of poor Dorothea dashing like a warm, sunny wave against so cold and repulsive a rock. He is a little too dreadful for anything. There does not seem to be a drop of warm blood in him, and so, as it is his misfortune and not his fault to be cold-blooded, one must not get angry with him. It is the scene in the garden, after the interview with the doctor, that rests on our mind at present. There was such a man as he over in Boston, high in literary circles, but I fancy his wife wasn't like Dorothea, and a vastly proper time they had of it, treating each other with mutual reverence, like 2 Chinese mandarins. My love, what I miss in this story is just what we would have if you would come to our tumbled-down, jolly, improper but joyous country, namely, Jollitude. You write and live on so high a plane. It is all self-abnegation. We want to get you over here and into this house, where with closed doors we sometimes make the rafters ring with fun, and say anything and everything, no matter what, and won't be any properer than we's a mind to be. I am wishing every day you could see our America, travel as I have been doing from one bright, thriving, pretty, flowery town to another, and see so much wealth, ease, progress, culture, and all sorts of nice things. This dovecot where I am now is the sweetest little nest imaginable, fronting on a city street, with back windows opening on a sea view, with still, quiet rooms filled with books, pictures, and all sorts of things, such as you and Mr. Lewes would enjoy. Don't be afraid of the ocean now. I've crossed it 6 times, and assure you it is an overrated item. Froude is coming here, why not you? Besides, we have the fountain of eternal youth here, that is, in Florida, where I live, and if you should come you would both of you take a new lease of life, and what glorious poems and philosophies and what not we should have. My rabbi writes in the 7th heaven an account of your note to him. To think of his setting off on his own account when I was away. Come now, since your answer to dear Miss Fields is yet to come, let it be a glad yes, and we will clasp you to our heart of hearts. Your ever-loving H.B.S. End of Chapter 20, Part 1. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana.